After a distinguished career in the armed forces, he was ready to discover what the next chapter of his life had in store.
He always loved kids and wanted to do something that would make a difference in his community.
He fell in love with teaching.
And he also fell in love with a beautiful coworker.
He was a hopeless romantic. He felt like he found the one. They were going to live a life happily ever after.
But their fairy tale ending gets cut short by an unexpected tragedy.
She just found her husband unresponsive.
She had suspected there was some foul play.
We went like this, and we went.
When police launch their investigation, they'll discover a sophisticated killer who will do anything to evade justice.
She said she got a phone call from an anonymous number. It was a male voice.
All I heard was, ask them about Tennessee.
She believed that he may have been poisoned.
We were totally shocked.
This crime was planned out and premeditated.
But the true extent of their plan was still unfolding.
They tried to recruit somebody to kill a key witness.
Hey, listen, something's happened to your friend.
The judge said, I have never witnessed such a stone-cold person. It's disgusting.
September 9th, 2000, Montebello, California. It's a quiet evening in this charming community located just a few miles from the heart of downtown LA.
Montebello is a completely different world when it comes to the greater Los Angeles area. It's kind of more like a suburb area.
Many families come to enjoy some of the peace outside of being in the city.
But at 3 a.m., the peaceful night is interrupted when local resident Angelina Rodriguez makes a desperate call to 911.
I just found my husband on the floor and he's not breathing. I need help right now.
To 911 operators, it's clear time is of the essence.
Police were immediately dispatched to the home.
When first responders arrive, it's just as Angelina claimed. Her husband, Frank, is completely unresponsive.
They found him on the side of his bed, as if he had collapsed while trying to get up.
Do you know how he ended up on the floor?
I don't know, I just found him like that.
They do everything in their power to try and provide first aid, to try and resuscitate him, but Frank Rodriguez is pronounced dead on the scene.
Time of death, 3:19.
Oh, God.
I'm so sorry, man.
Frank.
Navy veteran Francisco Frank Rodriguez balanced his strong sense of responsibility with a gentle spirit.
He was kind. He would never hurt anybody, and overall, just a person that everybody wanted to be around. Frank was the man.
Frank was also a devout Christian. His religion and living out his faith was very important to him.
He didn't smoke, drink, do drugs.
In 1996, after a successful 10-year career in the armed forces, Frank decided it was time to pursue his true calling.
He always loved kids and wanted to do something that would make a difference in his community. And he felt that working with children, he could make a large impact in young people's lives.
So when Frank secured a job at a private school in California's Central Coast, he was overjoyed.
He landed a teaching job in San Luis Obispo, teaching at Angel Gate Academy.
Angel Gate is through the National Guard. It's a program for troubled youth that needs some rehabilitating.
So when they came there, Frank would teach them basically life skills, how to get out of trouble, make a life for yourself, and teach them how to be a person instead of what they were doing on the streets.
And for the first time in his life, he found like he really, truly found his purpose.
But purpose wasn't all Frank found at his new job. He also found love.
We still on for dinner tonight?
Absolutely.
He started dating a fellow school employee named Angelina Morales.
She worked somewhere in the kitchen area, serving food. He thought she was beautiful.
Angelina was also a devout Christian, just like Frank.
He saw a woman who was just as much passionate and in love with God as he was, and Frank fell hard.
Well, I'm gonna let you get back to it, and I'll see you later.
Sounds good. I'll come get you as soon as I'm done with these papers.
They seemed to really be in love. Frank was always looking for his love of his life, and they seemed happy.
After a whirlwind romance, the happy couple tied the knot in April of 2000, just 3 months after they met.
Frank and Angelina may have moved fast, but they were so in love they couldn't bear to wait any longer.
Shortly after they got married, Frank also received a new position in Los Angeles.
The couple picked up and moved 200 miles south to the LA suburb of Montebello.
The two of them are headed to the suburbs to build this life together.
But just 6 months after saying I do, it appears Frank's heart has stopped beating.
Angelina found him unresponsive on the floor of their bedroom.
Time of death, 319.
So sorry.
At first, no one is sure how Frank died.
There was no obvious lacerations. There was no obvious abrasions.
Was it a medical emergency that claimed his life? Maybe a heart attack? A brain aneurysm?
But Angelina insists it was something else.
Somebody did this to him. This was no accident.
Angelina Rodriguez had suspected there was some foul play possibly in her husband's death.
She was pretty sure that somebody had poisoned my brother.
In the fall of 2000, 41-year-old Navy veteran Frank Rodriguez was living a comfortable suburban life with his new bride, Angelina Rodriguez.
It seemed like things were very promising and that they were going to live a life happily ever after.
But now, Frank has been found dead in the newlyweds' Montebello, California home.
He didn't have any visible injuries or signs of foul play.
Was it a medical emergency that claimed his life? Maybe a heart attack? A brain aneurysm?
According to Angelina, there's a more nefarious possibility.
She was pretty sure that somebody had poisoned my brother.
This was no accident. I can feel it.
At this point, emotions are high, so maybe Angelina is just overreacting, but investigators want to see if there's any validity to her theory.
While Frank's body is transported to the coroner's office for an autopsy, Angelina accompanies officers back to the station for a sit-down with detectives.
Hi, Angelina. Nice to meet you. Very good. Let's rush.
Investigators cut right to the chase.
You believe there's a possibility that your husband was poisoned? Yes, sir.
Angelina informed the police that Frank was extremely healthy, but over the last several days, he became gravely ill. He was throwing up every half hour, extremely sick, vomiting, and diarrhea.
If you want to go to the doctor, he goes, no, I'm fine, it's 10 o'clock. Typical stubborn man.
But 2 days before his death, Frank's symptoms seemed to be getting worse, and Angelina knew she had to act fast.
And he was just paler than anything. And I said, that's it. I'll take him to the doctor.
Doctors ran all the standard tests, but they couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. They said Frank probably just had food poisoning or maybe a stomach flu.
Doctor said, you can go home as long as you get rest, get food, take your medicine the way you're supposed to.
Angelina says when Frank returned from the hospital, she continued nursing him back to health, and he seemed to be improving.
Well, I'm going to get out of your space so you can get some rest, but if you need anything else, just give me a shout.
Sounds good, darling.
I'm thinking the worst is over. Now I can just, relax, and I fell asleep. I fell asleep on the couch. And then I woke up at about 3, and I said, time for me to go to bed. And that's when I found him.
Frank? Frank!
As for why Angelina now suspects foul play in her husband's death, she says it has everything to do with the timing of when Frank got sick.
She says around the same time Frank got sick, he had taken a short contracted position with his previous workplace, Angel Gate Academy. They were going to bus in some kids from LA near where Frank and Angelina now lived, up to San Luis Obispo, where the school is located, and they wanted Frank to help.
They offered him $220 just to escort the bus of kids as a disciplinary teacher to San Luis and to ride it back.
So you just riding along to chaperone, basically?
Yeah.
But Angelina says she urged Frank against taking another job with their former employer.
When we worked at Angegate, we both realized or recognized that there was child abuse.
Angelina explains the culprit was a school instructor named Jack Parker.
I had witnessed a situation where he would look in the latrine, the bathrooms, while the girls were getting dressed. Then he would go into one of the bays, the quarters, and just stand there and watch the girls. You know, I wasn't comfortable with that.
Frank?
Yes, sir?
Angelina says when she shared her concerns with Frank back in April, he was horrified.
Wow, are you sure?
Yes, I know what I saw.
And because Frank loved the children that he worked with and he loved his job, he decided to take it a step further and report this to the Child Protective Services, CPS, and an investigation was launched.
According to Angelina, that's when Jack started making threats.
He looked at me and had said, if anybody jeopardizes my job, I will kill them.
Detectives in Montebello, California, are speaking with Angelina Rodriguez about the untimely death of her husband, Frank.
Angelina believes Frank's former co-worker, Jack Parker, poisoned Frank as payback for reporting him to CPS.
You mentioned threats. What threats are there?
He looked at me and had said, if anybody jeopardizes my job, I will kill them. He looked at Frank and he went like this, and he went, right, dead on, eye to eye.
According to Angelina, this incident with Jack Parker was the main reason why they left Angelgate and decided to pursue employment somewhere else.
But Angelina says when Angelgate Academy reached out to Frank about the contracted position in late August, he felt it was his duty to help.
I had asked Frank not to go, but Frank was an idealist. And he thought everything will be okay.
On September 5th, Frank rode a bus up to San Luis Obispo with a group of middle school kids, escorting them to the academy.
When I get back, I said, so how is everybody there? They were great. They walked up to me, they hugged me, they said they missed me, and they gave me Gatorade and cookies and a snack. There was no animosity.
However, once he fell ill, she became extremely suspicious.
Maybe back here a second. Did he say who offered him the Gatorade?
Angelina says it was none other than Jack Parker.
Apparently, the CPS investigation failed to find any proof of abuse, so Jack still had his same position at the academy.
She suspected that maybe he had given Frank snacks and drink with maybe some poison in it.
I don't know what else it could be. For him being as healthy as he was to...
Detectives share Angelina's concerns.
They do believe it's suspicious that he fell ill right after visiting Angelgate.
They're hoping the autopsy report can provide some clarity on whether or not Frank died of natural causes or some sort of poisonous substance like Angelina believed.
While they await the autopsy results, detectives investigate their new lead.
They want to speak to Jack Parker.
We ended up going up north to talk to him along with several other people and just find out where he was, if he had saw Frank, if he had any words with Frank at all.
When investigators sit down with Jack, he readily admits that he had a falling out with Frank a few months ago.
Of course it made me mad. Wouldn't it make you mad? I almost lost my job over that. Those rumors aren't true.
So did you decide to punish the person for putting you in that position?
punish him? That's crazy.
He agreed that he was upset at this whole entire incident, but even though he was upset, he did not poison Frank.
He further mentioned that on September 5th, he did not see Frank at Angel Gate.
I didn't even know he was here.
It was a last-minute request from Angel Gate Academy, so when Frank got up there, no one knew he was coming. It was a surprise. So how would Jack know Frank was coming to have poison on hand?
When detectives follow up with Jack's coworkers, they confirm his account.
There is no way Jack would poison someone.
If there's anyone you should be looking at, it's Frank's wife.
Angelina?
While talking to detectives, Frank's former coworkers paint a troubling picture of his marriage to Angelina.
They report that although the parties had only been married for a very short period of time, the marriage was on the rocks.
As more details were coming to light, there were some red flags being raised.
Police soon learned that Frank isn't Angelina's first, second, or third husband. This is the fourth time she has been married, all by the age of 32.
I knew something was off the moment that she started working here.
How so?
She was so desperate to get any guy's attention.
People at Angel Gate described her as a chameleon. And prior to her starting a relationship with Frank, she had this infatuation for another employee who was kind of a cowboy.
Many of her colleagues say that Angelina was dressing like a cowgirl day to day, trying to pique this man's interest. She even had bumper stickers on her car to kind of stamp her as a down-home cowgirl.
But when that didn't work out, she started talking to Frank.
Here's Frank, a very religious, very spiritual man, read his Bible religiously. So now she starts reading the Bible. She puts Jesus Christ bumper stickers on her car.
Frank ended up falling for her act.
She convinced him to marry her after like 3 months of dating. It all happened really fast.
Around that same time, Angelina started accusing Jack Parker of sexually abusing students at the school.
Do you think there's any validity to her claims?
Absolutely not. But Frank, he believed everything she said, which is why he reported Jack to CPS.
Former co-workers say Angelina really got in Frank's head and made him believe something about Jack that wasn't true.
Wow, are you sure?
Yes, I know what I saw.
Why do you think she'd make something up like that about Jack?
I have no clue. The woman's crazy.
Detectives agree that Angelina's behavior is rather concerning.
After traveling back to Montebello, the detectives decide to interview Frank's family to see if they share similar concerns about his marriage to Angelina.
Something definitely wasn't right with her.
They started to notice that there was trouble in paradise very early on.
They were fighting a lot and just weren't happy together.
Frank would call me on the phone a lot. But when they got married, the calls got less and less and less. And I remember one call that I got from him, and he was whispering. And in his whisper voice, he'd say, well, she doesn't want me to call the family anymore.
Then a few days before he died, I got a call from Angelina.
Angelina casually informed her that Frank had fallen ill.
She said he was going to the hospital frequently, and the hospital would send him home with no diagnosis except flu symptoms or ulcers or whatever it was.
We didn't think much of it because she didn't really say how serious it had gotten.
You think, okay, well, if he needs me, he'll call. And then the next call I get is in September.
That's when Angelina informed them that Frank had passed.
I remember I fell to the table and I started bawling. I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't get to say goodbye. We all thought he had a heart attack.
But now, Frank's family suspects foul play.
I think Angelina did this to him.
And as suspicion of Angelina Rodriguez mounts, it seems she's starting to feel the heat.
She starts making these really odd phone calls to the investigators.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Did you guys get anything at all from the coroner?
The autopsy results have yet to come back. However, Angelina is really pushing for some results and is calling the detectives day in and day out.
Well, they don't have anything yet. It takes time for this type of stuff.
When the detectives eventually ask Angelina what is the rush, she tells them something very unexpected.
She needs Frank's death certificate so she can file an insurance claim.
She wanted that money.
After speaking with several of Frank Rodriguez's family members and former coworkers, Montebello detectives are starting to believe his wife, Angelina, had something to do with his untimely death.
Angelina has been calling detectives repeatedly asking about the results of Frank's autopsy.
Did you guys get anything at all from the coroner?
She needs Frank's death certificate so she can file an insurance claim.
She wanted that money.
But she wasn't going to get that money till there was a cause of death on the certificate.
The detectives learned that just 2 months prior, Angelina and Frank took out a $250,000 life insurance policy on Frank's life. This is in addition to 2 other hefty policies that Frank had from his previous employment.
And when detectives call the couple's insurance agent up, he reveals a very shocking piece of information.
He tells police that Angelina tried to file a claim on Frank's insurance policy less than 5 hours after he died.
This is certainly not the behavior of a grieving widow.
When the autopsy report finally comes in, it does little to help Angelina's cause.
The coroner was not able to determine Frank's cause of death.
They didn't find any physical trauma. They didn't find any aneurysm.
In addition, all the standard toxicology tests came back negative.
Is it possible that Frank wasn't poisoned at all and he really did die from natural causes?
While detectives continue their search for answers, Frank's family attends his funeral, where he is laid to rest with full military honors and a 21-gun salute.
At the funeral, Angelina, she did not shed a tear. Her demeanor was just cold. She didn't care that my brother had passed. There was nothing there.
But that's not the only thing that makes Frank's family uncomfortable.
She said something about oleander, and my family's looking at her like, what are you talking about, oleander? Well, that's a poison. Maybe they should test for oleander in his system.
Oleander is not typically included in the standard toxicology report.
There's no reason for Angelina to suspect that plant was used to poison Frank unless she knows more than she's letting on. So the family relayed this unsettling info to police.
And in the following days, Angelina gets even more persistent with her calls to detectives.
She was very adamant about asking us when we were going to arrest Jack. And she said she got a phone call from an anonymous number. It was a male voice telling her that he had something to tell her.
They said they wanted to tell me what was going on because they had a lot of respect for Frank, but they couldn't tell me who they were. And they said, you need to know a conversation I had.
He told her that he had spoken with Jack, and Jack had told him that he was responsible for killing Frank, and that Jack told him that they're never going to be able to prove it, and they're never going to be able to pin it on me.
You can't pin me. You can't pin me. It started breaking up, and all I heard was ask them about antifreeze.
Just like oleander, antifreeze wouldn't show up in a usual toxicology report. So investigators immediately order another round of tests to look for the poisons in Frank's body.
As detectives await the results, they examine Angelina's phone records, checking to see if she was being truthful about the anonymous call she received.
Angelina tells the police that she received that anonymous call at about 8 a.m. on October 19th.
But he looked into her phone records, and she did not receive any phone calls even near the time that she said she received a phone call.
And when the results from the new toxicology tests come in, it's just what detectives suspected.
He died from a combination of oleander and antifreeze.
Frank's cause of death was poisoning.
Now more than ever, investigators are confident Angelina Rodriguez killed her husband.
She's been the one indirectly leading investigators to these items, and detectives feel like they want to go in for a confession.
So they reached out to Jack Parker, the person Angelina originally accused of killing Frank.
We asked him if he would call Angelina and question her about why she's pointing the finger at him, and we could be listening to it and recording it on the other end.
They're hoping she'll slip and confess to the crime.
Jack agrees, and on December 13th, detectives move forward with their plan.
Hello?
Angelina?
Yes?
Why did you tell the police that I poisoned Frank with antifreeze?
She was shocked when he called.
On December 13th, 2000, detectives in Montebello, California are trying to catch murder suspect Angelina Rodriguez in a lie.
They believe she poisoned her husband and tried to frame his former coworker, Jack Parker, for the crime.
We asked Jack if he would call Angelina and question her about why she's pointing the finger at him, and we could be listening to it and recording it on the other end.
Hello?
Angelina?
Yes?
Why did you tell the police that I poisoned Frank with antifreeze?
She was shocked when he called.
But she didn't take the bait.
Who is this?
My main question, Angelina, is
How did you get my number?
I wanted Angelina. I'm just wondering how in the world this could ruin my life.
You know what? You need to call the investigator. I'm ending this conversation.
Okay, Angelina.
Angelina hung up that phone call and didn't provide Jack with any additional information once she was confronted.
Detectives are disappointed they didn't get the confession they need. But when Angelina's best friend, Lisa Wilson, comes forward, the investigation starts looking up again.
I have some information that I think will be useful to you.
Lisa and Angelina, their relationship was quite close. Like many friends, they tell all.
Sometimes we would complain to each other about our marriages, and Angelina didn't hold back when it came to her feelings about Frank.
Lisa tells the investigators that just a few months after their marriage, Angelina was already tired of Frank, and she began cheating on him.
There were various other men. And I asked her, why don't you just, get a divorce? And then she would go on and on about some life insurance policy.
If she divorced Frank, she'd get nothing. But if something happened to Frank, she'd get a hefty payout.
Angelina had been talking about poisons and stuff, and Angelina was very interested in antifreeze.
If that wasn't unsettling enough, a phone call Lisa had with Angelina a few days later sent shivers down her spine.
She asked Angelina what she was doing because she heard a noise, and Angelina told Lisa that she was making Frank a special milkshake because he liked milkshakes when he wasn't feeling well.
Oh, is Frank sick?
And Angelina responded, not yet.
What is that supposed to mean?
Don't worry about it. I'll talk to you later.
I think she was poisoning him that very second.
Detectives wholeheartedly agree. There's no doubt in their minds Angelina poisoned Frank to death.
So on February 7th, 2001, nearly 5 months after Frank was killed, they head to Angelina's home with an arrest warrant.
The detectives decide that they were going to try one more time to elicit a confession out of Angelina.
Good morning. Morning. How's it going today?
They play it cool at first, so she'll think it's just a routine follow-up interview.
However, once investigators sit down with Angelina inside the home, they start to reveal why they're really there.
We got a little problem, though.
What? They told her that it was impossible for Jack to have poisoned Frank.
Unless he was visiting you guys on Friday, he couldn't have done this. The stuff that Frank had in his stomach, he had to ingest within a couple hours of his death. They found it in his stomach, the liquid, the antifreeze, and it has to, liquids purge every couple hours.
Angelina, did you give Frank antifreeze?
No, I didn't. I love my husband. I would not do that.
Even when confronted point blank, Angelina denies any involvement in her husband's murder.
Let's think about this a second. You're the only person with him. You're taking care of him. You're feeding and giving him liquids to drink. We have an abundant amount of information that points that you poisoned Frank.
I didn't poison my husband. I mean, I am willing to take a lie detector test. I did not poison my husband.
Angelina does not budge.
I did not kill my husband.
I'm gonna tell you, we don't believe you. Okay. You stand up.
Are you arresting me?
Yes, you are under arrest for the murder of Frank.
No! I didn't kill my husband!
Angelina breaks down into tears when she realizes that she is being arrested.
Oh, God, please. I didn't kill my husband, I swear.
But by now, detectives see through her act and don't buy a word she's saying.
She's charged with first-degree murder. Investigators believe this crime was planned out and premeditated.
With Angelina finally behind bars and her trial date rapidly approaching, investigators think this case is just about over.
But soon, detectives realize that Angelina has no intentions of going down quietly.
Yes, the detective signed one.
Angelina was trying to kill one of the witnesses in her case, and that witness ultimately was Lisa. After nearly 6 months of building a strong circumstantial case against Angelina Rodriguez, Montebello authorities have finally arrested her for the poisoning death of her husband, Frank Rodriguez.
You are under arrest for the murder of Frank.
No! I didn't kill my husband!
With Angelina behind bars, investigators feel confident they are finally about to close this case once and for all.
But while awaiting trial in a Los Angeles County jail, Angelina has made one last desperate attempt to secure her freedom.
She is trying to have the star witness, her once close friend Lisa, murdered.
I received a phone call from a jail employee that said that they were contacted by an informant who told them that Angelina was trying to get her to kill Lisa. She agreed to record conversations she was having with Angelina about how and when to kill Lisa.
You think that if they made it look like a suicide, they'd be bright enough to figure a way to do that? They can do it robbery gone bad, or they can make it look like a boyfriend gone mad. If they get cyanide, then, that would do it real quick, you know what I'm saying?
Angelina had scenarios all the way from blowing up the house to maybe even poison her. So with that information, we devised a plan.
They essentially decide to fake Lisa's death.
Police informed Lisa of the plot by Angelina to take her life, and Lisa agrees to help the police.
We picked up some fake blood and a fake bullet hole that we could put on Lisa's head, and we basically took Polaroid photographs of Lisa on her bed in her bedroom, which Angelina would recognize.
Then an undercover officer posing as the hitman heads to the Los Angeles jail where Angelina is being held.
Hey, listen, something's happened to your friend. Hey.
Oh, what?
Right.
Within a few seconds, she's like, oh my God, I'm going home.
I am so ready to go home. I'm like, you know what? I'm going home.
And then by the end of the visit, typical Angelina, being very promiscuous, was asking the deputy about basically getting together and hooking up after she got out of jail.
You know, I gotta tell you, I feel really embarrassed.
Why?
Because, you know, what a way to start a conversation. What a blind, I guess you call it a blind date, huh?
However, little does Angelina know she won't be going on another date anytime soon.
If you learn anything from Angelina's case, it's that a big mouth gets you in big trouble.
And when her trial finally begins in October of 2003, prosecutors contend that just as Angelina attempted to take the life of her friend, she took the life of her husband through premeditated murder.
Based in large part on the testimony by Lisa Wilson, the prosecution alleged that Angelina was fed up with her marriage to Frank shortly after they got married and was looking for a way out of the relationship.
She was essentially bored of him and ready to move on to the next guy, but not without getting his money first.
Instead of filing for divorce like she had with previous husbands, Angelina devised a more sinister plot.
Because there was a large life insurance policy in place, this gave her the reason to want to kill Frank.
Prosecutors allege that in September of 2000, Angelina began poisoning Frank with oleander that she harvested herself.
The neighbors behind her had an oleander tree in their backyard that was growing over their fence, which she plucked from.
She used it in liquid form to put in Frank's food and drink.
But the oleander wasn't working fast enough.
The oleander made Frank ill enough to put him in the ER, but it did not kill him, and his demise did not come fast enough for Angelina.
Whatever the doctor gave me is working. I'm starting to feel a lot better.
Well, isn't that wonderful?
She stepped it up to a more potent poison and gave him antifreeze.
I made you a special treat.
According to the coroner's report, Angelina administered the final dose of antifreeze just hours before Frank's passing.
We were totally shocked that she would go to such lengths as antifreeze and oleander because it's such a slow death.
Had she not raised so much concern about it and let things take its course, there's a possibility that it might not have been detected.
She potentially could have gotten away with this murder.
But she wanted money. She was very greedy. It helped us solve the murder against Frank.
At the end of their deliberations, the jury announces their verdict.
The jury finds Angelina guilty of first-degree murder for financial gain.
But the story still isn't over yet.
At Angelina's sentencing hearing, prosecutors reveal a shocking new piece of information.
They uncovered evidence to suggest that Angelina murdered her 13-month-old daughter back in 1993.
Her daughter had died as a result of a pacifier nipple being lodged in her throat.
At the time, there was a recall on that brand of pacifiers, so Angelina sued the manufacturer.
She walked away with over $700,000 and an additional life insurance policy of $50,000 that she took out on the baby.
But now prosecutors have reason to believe it was Angelina's plan all along.
We had gotten pictures of the pacifier from the coroner's office. The recall said it could come unglued from the backing plate. But if you looked at these pictures, you could tell that there were jagged tears, but it was still glued. This pacifier didn't fail. It was basically, nipple was ripped off of it.
Prosecutors were hoping that this information would help the jury understand why Angelina needed to be sentenced to the harshest punishment possible.
The prosecution's strategy works.
The jury sentenced Angelina to death.
At the end, the judge said, I have never witnessed such a stone-cold person in the way your behavior was with no emotion, and what you did to this person, it's disgusting.
Due to the statute of limitations, Angelina is never formally charged in the death of her 13-month-old daughter, but she'll have to spend the rest of her life paying for what she did to Frank Rodriguez.
As of today, Angelina is still on death row.
However, after a moratorium on the death penalty in California in 2019, there are no current plans to execute Angelina.
Angelina is a psychopath.
She was a manipulator. She knew exactly how to manipulate my brother, Frank.
Angelina was willing to do whatever she needed to do to get her money, and I believe wholeheartedly in my mind that if she got away with Frank's murder, she's one of those people that wouldn't stop. She'd do it again and again and again until she was caught.
The way she murdered him, it was sickening. She had no intentions of ever loving my brother. And that's sad because my brother loved her. He was just one of those loving, caring people.
The journey began with what should have been an ordinary favor. In November 1987, 20-year-old Jay Cook and 18-year-old Tanya Van Quillenborg left Vancouver, British Columbia, intending to drive south into Washington state. Their destination was Seattle, where they planned to deliver furnace parts for Jay's father, who owned a construction business. They expected to be gone only briefly before returning home. Family members saw nothing unusual in their departure. The couple had been dating for some time and were described by those who knew them as responsible, kind, and excited about building their future together. There was no indication that the trip would become one of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting unsolved murder cases. Cross-border travel between British Columbia and Washington was common, and the route they planned to take was familiar to thousands of travelers every week. The drive followed busy highways connecting neighboring communities, separated only by an international border. Yet somewhere after entering the United States, something interrupted their plans. The exact sequence of events has never been fully reconstructed because neither Jay nor Tanya survived to explain what happened. Investigators later established that the couple crossed into Washington on November 18, SIL 1987. From that point forward, their movements became increasingly difficult to trace. Unlike today, there were no smartphones recording locations, no GPS histories, and very few surveillance cameras documenting ordinary travel. Once they disappeared, investigators had to rely almost entirely on physical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and traditional detective work. The first major clue emerged on November 20th when a worker discovered Tanya Van Quillenborg's body near a rural roadside in Skagit County, Washington. She had suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the head. Authorities determined that she had also endured a violent assault before her death. The location where she was found appeared to be a place chosen to conceal rather than commit the crime, suggesting that her killer had transported her there after the attack. Almost simultaneously, another mystery deepened. Jay Cook remained missing. Search efforts intensified as investigators attempted to determine whether Jay had been separated from Tanya or whether both had fallen victim to the same offender. For days later, on November 24th, another grim discovery answered part of that question. Jay's body was found in a wooded area near Monroe, Washington, several dozen miles from where Tanya had been discovered. He had been strangled with ligatures. The distance between the two crime scenes immediately complicated the investigation, indicating that whoever committed the murders had moved the victims independently. The vehicle the couple had been driving, a bronze Ford van, was eventually located abandoned in Portland, Oregon, hundreds of miles south of both crime scenes. The discovery created even more questions than answers. Why had the van been taken so far away? Was Portland the killer's destination, or had abandoning the vehicle there simply been an attempt to mislead investigators? No definitive answer emerged. From the outset, detectives recognized that the murders displayed characteristics suggesting planning rather than spontaneity. The victims had been separated. Their bodies had been left in different counties. A van had been abandoned in another state entirely. Each action increased the complexity of reconstructing the crime and identifying a suspect. Investigators from multiple jurisdictions became involved. Law enforcement agencies in Washington coordinated with Canadian authorities because both victims were Canadian citizens. Cooperation across the international border was essential, but the challenges were significant. Evidence had to be shared across agencies, witness interviews coordinated, and timelines reconciled between different investigative teams. Family members found themselves caught between grief and uncertainty. Jay and Tanya had left home expecting nothing more dramatic than delivering equipment. Instead, relatives were suddenly forced to confront a tragedy that seemed almost impossible to understand. Friends described the victims as young people with plans, ambitions, and close family ties. Their murders shocked communities on both sides of the border. Detectives meticulously examined the van after its recovery. Every fingerprint, every fiber, and every potential biological trace became important. Forensic science in the late 1980s, however, was limited compared with modern standards. DNA profiling was still in its infancy. While investigators preserved biological evidence, many of the techniques that would later revolutionize criminal investigations either did not yet exist or were unavailable for routine casework. Witnesses were interviewed across Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia. Some reported seeing the couple during parts of their trip. Others recalled suspicious individuals or vehicles. Like many major investigations, hundreds of leads flowed into police departments during the early weeks. Some appeared promising but ultimately collapsed under scrutiny. Others simply could not be verified. One recurring challenge was determining exactly where the couple encountered their attacker. Investigators knew where the journey began and where the victims were eventually discovered, but the critical location, the point where events turned deadly, remained uncertain. Without that knowledge, narrowing the pool of potential suspects became extraordinarily difficult. The crime scenes themselves yielded important forensic evidence, including biological material preserved by investigators. Although contemporary testing could establish certain facts, it could not identify an unknown individual unless there was already a matching suspect available for comparison. Detectives carefully stored the evidence, hoping that future scientific advances might one day unlock answers unavailable in 1987. As weeks became months, public attention gradually diminished. New crimes dominated headlines, while the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg slowly entered the category investigators call a cold case. That designation did not mean the investigation ended. Detectives periodically reviewed evidence, revisited witness statements, and evaluated new information whenever it appeared. Yet no breakthrough arrived. For the victims' families, the passage of time brought little relief. Birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays became reminders of lives interrupted without explanation. Questions remained unanswered. Who had encountered the young couple? Why had they been targeted? Had the attack been random, or had the offender deliberately selected them? Publicly available evidence never established definitive answers to those questions. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, forensic science advanced dramatically. DNA analysis became increasingly sensitive, allowing investigators to develop profiles from biological material that earlier laboratories could not fully interpret. Cold case units across North America began reopening investigations once thought unsolvable. The Cook Van Cuylenborg murders were among those periodically re-examined as technology improved. Each scientific advance renewed cautious optimism. Detectives submitted preserved evidence for updated laboratory testing whenever new methods became available. The biological evidence recovered decades earlier remained remarkably valuable because investigators in 1987 had recognized its potential significance and preserved it carefully. Their decision would eventually prove critical. Still, progress remained slow. Even with a DNA profile, investigators faced a familiar obstacle. If the unknown offender had never submitted DNA to law enforcement databases, no direct match would appear. The case once again reached an impasse. The murders became known among investigators as an example of both the frustrations and the importance of preserving evidence. Detectives retired. New investigators inherited boxes of reports, photographs, maps, laboratory results, and interview transcripts. Each generation hoped to notice something previously overlooked. Each confronted the same fundamental problem. They possessed evidence pointing to an unknown individual but lacked a name. For nearly 3 decades, that mystery endured. Families continued to seek answers. Detectives continued to review files. Advances in forensic science continued to reshape criminal investigations around the world. Quietly, a new investigative approach, genetic genealogy, was beginning to emerge. It had not yet transformed criminal investigations, but its potential was becoming increasingly clear. Eventually, that innovation would intersect with evidence preserved since 1987, changing the course of one of the Pacific Northwest's longest-running homicide investigations and demonstrating how decisions made by investigators decades earlier could still influence the pursuit of justice many years after the crimes themselves. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg immediately presented investigators with an unusual challenge. The victims were Canadian citizens from British Columbia. Their journey had begun in Canada, but the crimes unfolded after they crossed into Washington state. Their bodies were discovered in separate locations in Washington, while the van they had been driving was later found abandoned in Portland, Oregon. From the beginning, the investigation extended across multiple jurisdictions, requiring cooperation between agencies in 2 countries and 3 major geographic regions. Law enforcement officers in Washington assumed responsibility for investigating the homicides because both victims were found within the state. At the same time, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and local police agencies in British Columbia worked closely with American investigators, helping establish the victims' backgrounds, reconstruct their activities before departure, and interview family members, friends, and anyone who might have had contact with the couple before they crossed the border. Investigators quickly confirmed that Jay and Tanya had left the Vancouver area on November 18, 1987, intending to deliver furnace parts to Seattle on behalf of Jay's father's business. Relatives described the trip as routine. Nothing suggested they anticipated danger. They packed for what appeared to be a short journey and expected to return home soon afterward. One of the first priorities was reconstructing the couple's movements after they entered the United States. In 1987, this task was considerably more difficult than it would be today. There were no smartphones recording location histories, no automated license plate readers, and only limited surveillance camera coverage. Detectives instead relied on receipts, witness interviews, physical evidence, and travel timelines. As reports were collected, investigators attempted to determine where the couple had last been seen together. Although certain portions of their journey could be established with reasonable confidence, significant gaps remained. Those missing hours became some of the most important and most frustrating questions in the case. The discovery locations added another layer of complexity. Tanya Van Quedlinburg's body was found in rural Skagit County, while Jay Cook's body was recovered several days later in Snohomish County. The considerable distance between the two sites suggested that the offender had transported the victim separately after the initial encounter. Investigators examined whether the locations had any known connection to one another or to possible suspects, but no definitive link emerged. The abandoned Ford van presented another major source of evidence. Located in Portland, Oregon, it had traveled far beyond the expected route between Vancouver and Seattle. Crime scene specialists processed the vehicle carefully, documenting fingerprints, collecting trace evidence, and preserving any biological material that might later become significant. Every item was photographed, cataloged, and stored according to forensic standards. At the time, DNA technology was still developing. Investigators understood that biological evidence could be important, but the forensic tools available in the late 1980s were limited compared with those that would become available decades later. Even so, technicians preserved evidence meticulously, recognizing that future scientific advances might allow more detailed testing. Detectives also explored the possibility that the offender had encountered the couple by chance rather than through prior acquaintance. They reviewed reports involving suspicious individuals, violent crimes, and known offenders operating in Washington during the same period. Because the murders involved multiple locations and an abandoned vehicle, investigators considered numerous scenarios, but publicly available records have not established a definitive reconstruction of exactly how the victims first encountered their attacker. Information flowed between agencies through regular meetings, written reports, and evidence exchanges. Cross-border cooperation required careful coordination because investigative procedures differed between Canada and the United States. Nevertheless, both countries shared the same objective: identifying the person responsible for the deaths of two young Canadians whose families continued to wait for answers. Public appeals generated numerous tips. Members of the public reported suspicious vehicles, unidentified individuals, and possible sightings connected to the victim's trip. As is common in major homicide investigations, many leads proved impossible to verify or were eventually ruled out after further investigation. Detectives nevertheless documented each report, recognizing that even seemingly minor information might later become important. Throughout the following months, forensic laboratories continued examining physical evidence collected from the crime scenes and the recovered van. Analysts compared fingerprints against available databases and evaluated biological samples using the best techniques then available. While valuable evidence was obtained, investigators still lacked a way to identify an unknown suspect unless that person's information already existed in law enforcement records. As the initial investigation slowed, the case transitioned into what law enforcement describes as a cold case, not because the investigation had ended, but because immediate investigative avenues had been exhausted. Detectives periodically reviewed the evidence, re-interviewed witnesses when appropriate, and evaluated new information whenever it became available. The preservation of evidence became one of the investigation's greatest strengths. Although investigators could not yet fully exploit every piece of forensic material, they maintained detailed records and carefully stored physical evidence. That decision reflected an understanding shared by experienced homicide investigators. Advances in forensic science could one day provide answers that contemporary technology could not. During the 1990s, DNA profiling became increasingly reliable and began transforming criminal investigations worldwide. Detectives working the Cook-Van Quillenborg case monitored these developments closely. As laboratory capabilities improved, preserved biological evidence from the investigation was re-examined using newer techniques. Each advance produced additional information, but identifying the unknown individual responsible remained elusive because no matching profile existed in the available law enforcement databases. Years passed, investigators retired, and new detectives inherited thousands of pages of reports, photographs, laboratory analyses, and interview summaries. Maintaining continuity became essential. Every new investigator had to understand not only the evidence itself, but also the reasoning behind earlier investigative decisions. Despite the absence of an identified suspect, the case remained active. Law enforcement agencies in Washington continued collaborating with Canadian authorities whenever new developments warranted renewed examination. Family members remained informed of significant investigative progress, while detectives emphasized that the case had never been forgotten. By the early 21st century, another scientific development was beginning to attract attention within the forensic community: investigative genetic genealogy. Initially used in limited circumstances, the technique offered the possibility of identifying unknown individuals through distant family relationships rather than direct matches in criminal DNA databases. At first, the method remained experimental and legally complex. Few could predict how dramatically it would reshape certain cold case investigations. For the Cook van Cuylenborg investigation, however, one crucial factor was already in place. Detectives had preserved biological evidence decades earlier with extraordinary care. Although they could not have anticipated the precise technology that would eventually become available, their commitment to evidence preservation ensured that future investigators would still have an opportunity to pursue answers. That careful work, carried out in the aftermath of the 1987 murders, laid the scientific foundation for the breakthrough that would eventually transform one of the Pacific Northwest's longest-running homicide investigations. As the years passed, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg became one of the many unsolved homicide investigations maintained by law enforcement in Washington state. Although public attention gradually shifted to newer cases, detectives continued to regard the investigation as active. Cold cases are rarely forgotten within homicide units. Instead, they often wait for a new witness, a new technology, or a previously overlooked connection that may finally change the course of the investigation. One of the most significant decisions made during the original investigation was the careful preservation of physical evidence. Crime scene investigators documented, packaged, and stored biological samples according to the forensic standards of the late 1980s. At the time, no one could predict how rapidly DNA technology would evolve over the following decades. Nevertheless, investigators recognized that preserving evidence intact offered the best chance for future scientific examination. During the 1990s, forensic DNA analysis became increasingly sophisticated. Laboratories were able to generate more complete DNA profiles from smaller or older biological samples than had been possible only a few years earlier. Detectives assigned to the Cook van Cuylenborg investigation periodically submitted preserved evidence for additional testing whenever improvements in laboratory methods became available. These examinations confirmed that investigators possessed DNA believed to have originated from an unknown male associated with the crimes. While this represented an important scientific achievement, it did not immediately identify a suspect. At the time, criminal DNA databases could only produce a direct match if the responsible individual had previously submitted DNA through a qualifying criminal conviction or another lawful collection process. No such match was found. Without a name attached to the DNA profile, the investigation remained at an impasse. Over time, responsibility for the case passed from one generation of detectives to another. Successive investigators reviewed thousands of pages of reports, crime scene photographs, laboratory findings, interview transcripts, and evidence inventories. Fresh perspectives sometimes generated new investigative ideas, but publicly available information indicates that none of these reviews produced sufficient evidence to identify the offender during those years. The cooperation between agencies in Washington and British Columbia also continued. Because Jay and Tanya were Canadian citizens, communication with Canadian authorities remained important whenever new investigative developments occurred. Family liaison officers worked to ensure that relatives were informed about significant progress while recognizing that many investigative details could not be released publicly. Cold case investigations often require balancing transparency with confidentiality. Detectives may possess information that has never been disclosed because releasing it could compromise future interviews or prevent investigators from verifying a suspect's statements. For that reason, not every detail collected during the original investigation became public knowledge. Meanwhile, forensic science continued advancing beyond traditional DNA profiling. Scientists developed increasingly sensitive techniques capable of analyzing degraded biological material and producing more reliable genetic profiles. Each advancement encouraged investigators to re-examine older evidence, including material preserved decades earlier in unsolved homicide cases. By the early 2000s, another important development was beginning to emerge outside conventional law enforcement databases: consumer genetic genealogy. Millions of people voluntarily submitted DNA samples to genealogy services to learn about family history and ancestry. Although these databases were created for genealogical research rather than criminal investigations, they demonstrated the possibility of identifying biological relatives through shared DNA. Eventually, investigators and forensic specialists began exploring whether this emerging field might assist certain unsolved homicide investigations. Rather than searching for an exact match, the method sought partial genetic relationships that could help investigators reconstruct family trees leading to an unidentified individual. The process required careful analysis, extensive genealogical research, and additional investigative work before any conclusions could be drawn. At the time, this approach remained relatively new. Investigators understood that genetic genealogy would not replace traditional detective work. Even if genealogy suggested a possible individual, every lead would still require independent corroboration through conventional investigative methods and legally obtained forensic evidence. For the Cook van Quedlinburg investigation, this development represented a potential opportunity rather than an immediate solution. Detectives first needed to determine whether the preserved biological evidence met the technical requirements for advanced genetic analysis. The quality of evidence collected in 1987 therefore became critically important. The careful work performed by the original crime scene investigators proved invaluable. Because biological evidence had been preserved appropriately, later forensic specialists were able to recover genetic information suitable for more advanced analysis than anyone could have imagined at the time the murders occurred. Even so, success was far from guaranteed. Genetic genealogy investigations frequently require months or years of research. Building family trees from distant DNA relationships involves reviewing historical records, public documents, birth and death certificates, census information, and other genealogical sources. Every potential connection must be verified before investigators focus on a specific individual. Throughout this period, detectives continued to emphasize that identifying a possible suspect through genealogy would represent only one stage of the investigation. Any eventual prosecution would still depend upon legally admissible evidence collected through established investigative procedures. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, the passing decades remained deeply painful. They had waited years without knowing who was responsible for the deaths of two young people whose trip across the Canadian border had ended in tragedy. Although scientific progress offered hope, investigators understood that hope alone could not substitute for evidence. By the middle of the 2010s, however, advances in forensic science had reached a point where investigators believed the preserved DNA evidence might finally yield information unavailable to previous generations of detectives. The investigation entered a new phase 1, driven not by eyewitness recollections or traditional suspect lists, but by developments in genetics and genealogy that had transformed the possibilities available to cold case investigators across North America. For the first time since 1987, there was cautious optimism that the evidence preserved decades earlier might finally reveal the identity of the unknown individual whose DNA had remained at the center of the investigation for nearly 30 years. By the mid-2010s, homicide investigators across the United States had begun paying close attention to a rapidly developing investigative technique, forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA database searches, which relied on finding an exact match between crime scene evidence and a known offender, this approach looked for shared DNA with biological relatives who had voluntarily submitted samples to genealogy databases that permitted law enforcement use under their policies at the time. The concept represented a significant shift in criminal investigations. Rather than asking whether an unknown DNA profile already existed in a criminal database, investigators could ask a different question: whether the unknown individual shared enough genetic material with distant relatives to begin reconstructing a family tree. The process did not identify a suspect directly. Instead, it generated investigative leads that required extensive genealogical research and independent verification. Detectives responsible for the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg recognized that this method might provide an opportunity unavailable during previous decades. The investigation still possessed well-preserved biological evidence collected in 1987. Earlier laboratory work had produced an unknown male DNA profile, but conventional database searches had failed to identify its source. Genetic genealogy offered a different pathway. To pursue this option, investigators collaborated with forensic specialists experienced in advanced DNA analysis. Before genealogy could begin, laboratories first needed to generate a genetic profile suitable for comparison with genealogy databases. This process required careful handling because the evidence had been preserved for many years. The quality of the original crime scene collection proved critical. Once a usable profile was obtained, genealogical researchers began examining potential biological relationships. Publicly available accounts indicate that this stage involved extensive historical and genealogical research rather than rapid computer matching. Distant relatives identified through DNA comparisons represented starting points, not conclusions. Researchers reviewed family histories, birth records, marriage records, death certificates, census information, and other publicly available documents to determine how separate family branches connected across generations. As investigators narrowed possible family lines, they continued applying traditional police work. Genealogical information alone was insufficient to identify the offender. Detectives compared timelines, locations, ages, and other investigative facts to determine whether any individual could plausibly have been connected to the crimes committed in Washington in November 1987. The investigation remained confidential throughout much of this process. Cold case detectives understood that premature disclosure could compromise their work. Public speculation might influence witnesses, alert individuals under consideration, or interfere with efforts to obtain legally admissible evidence. Consequently, many aspects of the genealogical research were conducted without public announcement. The case reflected a broader trend occurring across North America. Several long unsolved investigations were beginning to benefit from the combination of preserved forensic evidence and advances in DNA technology. Investigators increasingly emphasized that success depended on both modern science and the meticulous evidence preservation performed decades earlier. Without the biological evidence collected in 1987, later technological advances would have had little practical value. As genealogical research continued, investigators gradually focused on a smaller number of individuals whose family connections were consistent with the DNA evidence. At this stage, however, genealogy remained only an investigative tool. Before any person could be formally identified, detectives needed an independently obtained DNA sample suitable for direct comparison with the crime scene evidence. Law enforcement therefore continued using conventional investigative techniques. Surveillance, public records research, and legally authorized evidence collection remained essential components of the investigation. The objective was straightforward: obtain a DNA sample from the individual under investigation through lawful means and compare it directly with the biological evidence preserved from the crime scenes. Only such a direct forensic comparison could confirm or eliminate a suspect. Throughout this period, investigators also revisited the original case files. Reports prepared in 1987, witness interviews, forensic examinations, and crime scene documentation were reviewed alongside the new genealogical information. The goal was to determine whether historical investigative findings aligned with emerging forensic evidence. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg, these developments represented cautious optimism rather than certainty. After decades without an identified suspect, investigators remained careful not to promise an outcome until the scientific process had been completed and independently verified. Cold case investigations often generate promising leads that ultimately prove incorrect. Detectives therefore continued following established evidentiary standards before drawing conclusions. The Cook-Van Queilenborg investigation demonstrated how homicide cases can evolve over time. What began in 1987 as a traditional multi-jurisdictional investigation involving Washington and British Columbia had gradually incorporated scientific methods unavailable to the original investigators. Each stage built upon earlier work rather than replacing it. Crime scene documentation, evidence preservation, laboratory analysis, and witness interviews all remained relevant decades later. By 2018, investigators believed they had reached a critical stage. The genealogical research had substantially narrowed the field of inquiry, and detectives prepared to determine whether the individual identified through family tree analysis could be conclusively linked to the DNA recovered from the crime scenes. The next step would require a direct forensic comparison, one that investigators hoped would finally answer a question that had remained unresolved since November 1987. By early 2018, investigators believed they had reached a turning point in the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg. After decades of reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and applying successive generations of forensic science, they were now able to combine traditional investigative methods with forensic genetic genealogy. The objective remained the same as it had been since 1987: determine whether the unknown DNA profile preserved from the crime scenes could finally be associated with a specific individual through legally admissible evidence. Publicly available court records and law enforcement statements indicate that investigators worked with specialists in investigative genetic genealogy to analyze the preserved DNA. Rather than identifying a suspect directly, the process identified individuals who appeared to share distant biological relationships with the unknown contributor. Genealogists then reconstructed extensive family trees using publicly available historical records, including birth records, marriage records, census information, and other genealogical sources. This work required patience and careful verification. A shared DNA relationship alone did not establish involvement in a crime. Instead, it provided a starting point for investigators to narrow a large number of possible relatives to individuals whose age, location, and family history were consistent with the known facts of the investigation. As the genealogical analysis progressed, detectives eventually focused their attention on one family line. Additional research further reduced the number of potential individuals within that branch. According to public accounts of the investigation, one person emerged whose background warranted closer examination. Even at this stage, investigators did not regard genealogy as proof. Established investigative procedures required independent confirmation before any conclusions could be reached. Detectives therefore sought an opportunity to obtain a DNA sample through lawful investigative means. Such a sample could then be compared directly with the biological evidence recovered during the original homicide investigation. Law enforcement conducted surveillance consistent with obtaining a discarded item that could legally provide DNA. After the sample was recovered, forensic laboratories compared it with the DNA profile developed from evidence collected in 1987. According to court filings and public statements, the comparison indicated that the profiles matched. Following that confirmation, investigators identified the individual as William Earl Talbot Siffin in May 2018. He was arrested in Washington State and charged with the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg. The announcement represented a significant development in a case that had remained unsolved for more than 3 decades. For the families of the victims, the arrest marked the first major breakthrough since the murders occurred in November 1987. While an arrest does not determine guilt, it meant that investigators believed they had obtained sufficient evidence to bring the case before the courts. Law enforcement officials also emphasized the broader significance of the investigation. The Cook-Van Quillenborg case became one of the earliest homicide investigations in Washington state to be solved through forensic genetic genealogy. It demonstrated how biological evidence preserved decades earlier could be re-examined using scientific techniques that did not exist when the crimes were committed. The investigation also highlighted the continued importance of conventional detective work. Genealogy alone did not solve the case. Detectives still relied on evidence preservation, laboratory science, genealogical research, surveillance, and a direct forensic DNA comparison before making an arrest. Each component supported the others, illustrating that technological advances were most effective when combined with careful investigative practice. Following the arrest, prosecutors presented evidence in court, where the legal process examined the forensic findings and other evidence under established judicial standards. The defendant exercised the constitutional rights available in criminal proceedings, including the opportunity to challenge the evidence presented by the prosecution. The case ultimately proceeded to trial. Among the issues considered were the DNA evidence, the investigative genealogy process that led detectives to the suspect, and the corroborating forensic analyses obtained after investigators collected a direct DNA sample. The admissibility and reliability of these methods became important legal questions, reflecting the relatively recent use of investigative genetic genealogy in criminal cases at that time. In 2019, a jury found William Earl Talbot C.N. guilty of the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg. He was subsequently sentenced according to Washington law. In later proceedings, aspects of the case continued through the appellate process, as is common in serious criminal convictions. Those appeals addressed legal issues rather than changing the historical facts regarding the investigation itself. For investigators, the outcome represented the conclusion of one of Washington State's longest-running homicide investigations. For the victims' families, it brought a measure of resolution after more than 30 years of uncertainty. Although no criminal prosecution can reverse the loss of loved ones, identifying the person responsible ended decades of unanswered questions about who had committed the crimes. The Cook-Van Quillenborg investigation has since been widely studied by law enforcement agencies, forensic scientists, and legal scholars as an example of how advances in DNA technology can influence cold case investigations. At the same time, the case underscores a consistent principle in homicide investigations. Preserving evidence carefully at the time of the crime may allow future generations of investigators to apply scientific methods that were unimaginable when the evidence was first collected. The cooperation between investigators in Washington and British Columbia, the long-term preservation of forensic evidence, and the eventual application of genetic genealogy together transformed an investigation that had remained unresolved for decades into one of the most significant examples of modern cold case work in North America. The investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg has become a significant case study in the evolution of modern homicide investigations. What began in November 1987 as a complex cross-border investigation involving agencies in British Columbia and Washington State ultimately demonstrated how scientific advances, long-term evidence preservation, and cooperation between jurisdictions can influence the outcome of a cold case decades after the crimes occurred. Throughout the original investigation, detectives faced limitations common to the era. Witness statements, physical evidence, and conventional forensic methods formed the foundation of the case. Although investigators recovered biological evidence, the available DNA technology of the late 1980s could not identify an unknown offender unless a direct comparison sample was already available. As a result, the investigation remained active but unresolved for many years despite substantial investigative effort. One of the most important lessons highlighted by the case concerns evidence preservation. Crime scene investigators collected and stored biological material according to accepted forensic procedures of the time. That careful documentation allowed later generations of forensic scientists to revisit the evidence using techniques that had not yet been developed when the murders occurred. The case is frequently cited within law enforcement training as an example of why meticulous evidence collection and storage remain essential, even when immediate analysis cannot provide definitive answers. The investigation also illustrates the importance of institutional continuity. During the more than 3 decades between the crimes and the arrest, numerous detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and laboratory personnel contributed to the case. Personnel changed through retirements and reassignments, but detailed reports, Evidence inventories and investigative records enabled new investigators to understand previous work and continue the investigation without beginning again from the start. Cross-border cooperation remained another defining characteristic of the case, because Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg were Canadian citizens whose trip originated in British Columbia but whose murders occurred in Washington state. Authorities in both countries maintained communication throughout the investigation. Information sharing between Canadian and American agencies helped investigators reconstruct the victims' backgrounds, establish timelines, and coordinate investigative efforts across international boundaries. The eventual use of forensic genetic genealogy also influenced discussions within the legal and forensic communities. Following several high-profile cold case investigations during the late 2010s, law enforcement agencies began evaluating both the investigative potential and the legal considerations associated with genealogy-based techniques. Courts, policymakers, and forensic professionals have continued examining how these methods should be applied while balancing investigative needs, privacy considerations, and evidentiary standards. The Cook-Van Quillenborg investigation is often discussed alongside other cases that demonstrated the growing role of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. Despite these technological advances, investigators consistently emphasize that genealogy serves as an investigative lead rather than a substitute for conventional evidence. Direct DNA comparison, corroborating investigative findings, and judicial review remain essential before criminal charges can be sustained. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg, the passage of time fundamentally shaped their experience of the criminal justice process. More than 30 years separated the murders from the arrest announced in 2018. During that period, family members continued to participate in the investigation through communication with detectives and prosecutors while living with the uncertainty that accompanies unresolved homicide cases. Public statements made after the arrest reflected appreciation for the investigators who continued working on the case across several decades. Within the broader forensic community, the investigation reinforced another important principle. Scientific progress often depends upon decisions made long before the relevant technology exists. Evidence preserved in 1987 ultimately became central to investigative techniques developed many years later. Without the original collection and preservation of biological material, subsequent advances in DNA analysis and genetic genealogy would have had little practical application. Today, the case continues to be referenced in discussions of cold case methodology, forensic science, and international investigative cooperation. Training programs for investigators frequently examine the investigation as an example of how complex homicide cases may evolve over time and why unsolved cases continue to merit periodic review as scientific capabilities improve. Although the criminal investigation reached a legal resolution decades after the murders, the case remains historically significant because of its contribution to forensic practice. It demonstrates how cooperation between agencies in Washington and British Columbia, combined with advances in DNA science and sustained investigative commitment, transformed an investigation that had once appeared unlikely to be solved into one of the most widely cited examples of modern cold case work in North America. The investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg is now regarded as more than the resolution of a single homicide case. Within law enforcement and forensic science, it represents an example of how developments in technology can reshape investigative practice while reinforcing the importance of careful evidence preservation and long-term institutional commitment. When the investigation began in 1987, DNA profiling was still in its early stages. Detectives relied primarily on physical evidence, witness interviews, crime scene reconstruction, and conventional forensic comparisons. Although biological material was collected, the available scientific techniques could not identify an unknown individual without a direct comparison sample. Investigators therefore preserved the evidence with the expectation that future advances might provide additional opportunities. Over the following 3 decades, forensic science changed substantially. Laboratories developed more sensitive DNA testing methods, national DNA databases expanded, and new approaches to interpreting genetic information became available. At each stage, investigators revisited the evidence preserved from the Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation to determine whether emerging technology could produce additional information. The eventual application of investigative genetic genealogy demonstrated that scientific innovation often complements rather than replaces traditional investigative work. Genealogical analysis generated an investigative lead, but detectives still relied on established police procedures to obtain a legally admissible DNA sample and confirm the identity of the individual through direct forensic comparison. This combination of scientific analysis and conventional investigation has since become a model for many cold case inquiries. The case also highlighted the importance of interagency cooperation. Detectives, forensic laboratories, prosecutors, and specialists in genealogy all contributed expertise at different stages of the investigation. Because the victims were Canadian citizens and the crimes occurred in Washington state, communication between authorities in British Columbia and the United States remained an essential component throughout the life of the investigation. Beyond its investigative significance, the case contributed to discussions about the responsible use of forensic genetic genealogy. Legal scholars, forensic scientists, and policymakers have examined the investigative benefits of the technique alongside questions concerning privacy, database participation, and evidentiary standards. As additional jurisdictions adopted genealogy-based investigations, agencies increasingly developed formal policies governing when and how the method should be used. For families affected by unresolved homicide investigations, the Cook-Van Cuylenborg case also illustrated that the passage of time does not necessarily end an investigation. Cold cases may remain active for decades, particularly when preserved evidence exists and scientific methods continue to evolve. Detectives assigned to such investigations often review historical files repeatedly as new forensic capabilities become available. Law enforcement agencies across North America now frequently cite this investigation when discussing best practices in cold case management. The case demonstrates the value of maintaining complete investigative records, preserving biological evidence according to established protocols, and periodically reassessing unsolved cases rather than assuming that earlier investigative limitations will remain permanent. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg therefore occupy an important place in the history of forensic investigation. While the crimes themselves remain a tragic chapter for the victims' families and communities, the investigation's long trajectory from traditional detective work in 1987 to advanced DNA analysis decades later has informed the way many agencies approach unresolved homicide cases today. For investigators in both Washington and British Columbia, the case serves as a reminder that effective homicide investigations often extend far beyond the initial response. Scientific progress, institutional continuity, and collaboration between jurisdictions can together provide opportunities that were unavailable to the original investigators, reinforcing the principle that carefully preserved evidence may retain its value for generations. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg continue to be examined within law enforcement as an example of the challenges associated with investigating crimes that span multiple jurisdictions. The victims departed from British Columbia, traveled into Washington state, and their vehicle was later recovered in Oregon. From the earliest stages of the investigation, detectives were required to coordinate evidence, witness information, and investigative responsibilities across national and state boundaries. Cross-border investigations present practical and legal complexities that extend beyond ordinary homicide inquiries. Different agencies operate under separate legal authorities, maintain independent record systems, and follow distinct procedural requirements. Effective communication, therefore, becomes essential. In this investigation, authorities in Washington worked closely with Canadian agencies to reconstruct the victims' activities before they entered the United States, while investigators in the United States focused on the homicide scenes, forensic evidence, and events that occurred after the border crossing. The case also illustrates the importance of standardized forensic procedures. Evidence collected by one agency may later require examination by laboratories in another jurisdiction or become relevant during legal proceedings conducted years later. Careful documentation, secure evidence storage, and detailed chain of custody records ensured that the physical evidence collected in 1987 remained suitable for later forensic analysis when DNA technology had advanced substantially. From an investigative perspective, the case demonstrates how cold case reviews differ from the original inquiry, rather than repeating earlier investigative steps. Later detectives reassessed preserved evidence using newly available scientific techniques. Reports prepared decades earlier remained valuable because they documented the original crime scenes, witness interviews, and evidence collection in sufficient detail to support modern forensic analysis. The development of forensic genetic genealogy further expanded investigative possibilities. Although the technique generated an important investigative lead in this case, investigators consistently emphasized that genealogy functioned as one element within a broader investigative process. Any potential identification required confirmation through independently obtained DNA evidence and conventional investigative methods before legal action could proceed. The investigation has also contributed to ongoing discussions regarding best practices for long-term homicide case management. Agencies increasingly recognize the importance of maintaining organized investigative files, preserving biological evidence indefinitely when feasible, and periodically reviewing unsolved cases as forensic capabilities evolve. Scientific advances cannot assist an investigation if relevant evidence has not been properly preserved. For prosecutors and forensic scientists, the case reinforced the necessity of presenting complex scientific evidence in a manner that can be evaluated within established legal standards. DNA analysis, genealogical research, and traditional investigative findings each played distinct roles during the criminal proceedings. Together, they demonstrated how multiple forms of evidence may complement one another rather than relying on a single investigative technique. Beyond its legal significance, the investigation has had an educational impact within policing and forensic science. Training programs frequently reference the Cook-Van Quillenborg case when discussing evidence preservation, interagency cooperation, and the practical application of emerging forensic technologies. The investigation serves as an example of how persistence, careful documentation, and scientific progress can collectively influence the resolution of long unsolved homicide cases. Today, the case remains part of the broader history of forensic investigation in North America, It underscores that homicide investigations may extend across decades, requiring sustained institutional commitment as investigative personnel, scientific methods, and legal frameworks continue to evolve. The cooperation between authorities in Washington and British Columbia, combined with advances in forensic science, illustrates how complex investigations can benefit from long-term collaboration and the continued reassessment of preserved evidence. The investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg remains influential not only because of its outcome, but also because of the investigative methods it helped highlight. Since the resolution of the case, forensic professionals, homicide investigators, prosecutors, and legal scholars have continued to examine the investigation as an example of how scientific advances can reshape the examination of long unsolved crimes while remaining subject to established legal standards. One of the principal lessons concerns the long-term value of biological evidence. During the original investigation in 1987, crime scene personnel collected and preserved material that exceeded the immediate analytical capabilities of the time. Their decision reflected established forensic practice, preserved potentially relevant evidence even if contemporary laboratory methods cannot fully analyze it. As DNA technology improved over subsequent decades, those preserved samples became increasingly informative. The evolution of forensic DNA analysis occurred in several stages. Early profiling methods required relatively large biological samples and produced more limited results. Later techniques increased sensitivity, improved reliability, and allowed analysts to recover genetic information from smaller or more degraded samples. By the time investigators revisited the Cook Van Quedlinburg evidence using modern methods, laboratories were able to generate genetic profiles suitable for investigative genetic genealogy in addition to conventional forensic comparison. The case also illustrates the distinction between investigative tools and courtroom evidence. Genetic genealogy was used to generate investigative leads rather than to establish guilt independently. Once detectives identified a potential individual through genealogical research, they continued employing traditional investigative methods to obtain a legally collected DNA sample. That direct comparison between the suspect's DNA and the crime scene evidence formed an important component of the prosecution's case. This distinction has become increasingly important as additional jurisdictions consider the use of forensic genetic genealogy. Investigators generally regard genealogy as an extension of traditional investigative practice rather than a replacement for conventional evidentiary requirements. Court proceedings continue to rely upon established rules governing scientific evidence, chain of custody, laboratory procedures, and constitutional protections. The Cook Van Quedlinburg investigation further demonstrated the importance of comprehensive documentation. Every laboratory report, crime scene photograph, evidence inventory, witness statement, and investigative memorandum created during the original inquiry remained relevant decades later. New investigators could review historical materials without reconstructing the investigation from memory, allowing scientific advances to be applied within the context of the original factual record. For agencies responsible for cold case investigations, the case reinforced the value of periodic review. Advances in forensic science do not occur all at once. Improvements in DNA analysis, digital record management, genealogy, and other investigative disciplines emerge gradually over many years. Regular reassessment enables investigators to determine whether previously unresolved evidence may now yield additional information through newer methods. International cooperation also remained an enduring feature of the investigation. Although the murders occurred in Washington state, The victim's Canadian citizenship required continued communication between American and Canadian authorities. The investigation therefore serves as an example of how neighboring jurisdictions can coordinate complex homicide inquiries involving victims, witnesses, and investigative information that cross national borders. Since the conclusion of the criminal proceedings, the investigation has frequently appeared in professional discussions concerning forensic science, cold case methodology, and investigative collaboration. Universities, forensic training programs, and law enforcement organizations have referenced the case when illustrating the practical application of evolving DNA technology to historical investigations. The broader significance of the investigation extends beyond a single criminal prosecution. It demonstrates how advances in science may create new investigative opportunities without diminishing the importance of careful police work, accurate documentation, and lawful evidence collection. Each stage of the Cook Van Quillenborg investigation built upon earlier investigative efforts rather than replacing them. Today, the case remains part of the continuing development of modern homicide investigation. For investigators in Washington and British Columbia, as well as forensic professionals throughout North America, it illustrates how persistence, cooperation, and scientific progress can collectively influence the examination of crimes that once appeared unlikely to be resolved. The investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg illustrates how homicide investigations can extend across generations of investigators. While the crimes occurred in 1987, the scientific methods that ultimately contributed to identifying a suspect were developed many years later. This gap between the original investigation and later forensic advances has influenced how law enforcement agencies now approach evidence preservation, case management, and periodic review of unresolved homicides. Modern cold case investigations differ significantly from those conducted during the late 20th century. Digital evidence management systems now allow agencies to maintain comprehensive records that can be reviewed efficiently decades after an investigation begins. Laboratory techniques have become increasingly sensitive, permitting the analysis of biological material that would previously have been considered unsuitable for testing. At the same time, improved communication between agencies has simplified the exchange of investigative information across jurisdictions. The Cook Van Quillenborg investigation demonstrates that these developments do not diminish the importance of the original investigative work. On the contrary, later scientific analysis depended entirely upon evidence collected and documented by detectives and forensic personnel in 1987. Crime scene photographs, laboratory reports, evidence inventories, witness interviews, and chain of custody records all remained essential components of the investigation long after the initial inquiry had concluded. Another important aspect of the case is the relationship between technological innovation and legal procedure. Scientific techniques may generate new investigative opportunities, but criminal prosecutions continue to rely upon established evidentiary standards. Investigators must demonstrate that evidence has been lawfully collected, properly preserved, and scientifically reliable before it can be presented in court. The Cook Van Quillenborg investigation illustrates how emerging forensic methods can be incorporated into existing legal frameworks rather than replacing them. The case has also contributed to discussions regarding multidisciplinary cooperation. Detectives, forensic biologists, genealogists, prosecutors, crime scene specialists, and laboratory personnel each played distinct roles during different phases of the investigation. Their work demonstrates that successful cold case investigations often depend upon expertise drawn from multiple professional disciplines rather than a single investigative technique. Within law enforcement training, the investigation is frequently referenced when discussing long-term case management. Homicide units increasingly recognize that unresolved investigations require continued organization even after years have passed. Evidence must remain accessible, documentation must be preserved, and investigative decisions must be recorded clearly enough that future detectives can understand the reasoning behind earlier actions. The Cook Van Quillenborg investigation provides an example of how thorough documentation can support investigative continuity across several decades. The cross-border nature of the investigation further emphasizes the importance of institutional cooperation, because the victims began their journey in British Columbia and were killed in Washington state. Canadian and American authorities each possessed information necessary to reconstruct the events surrounding the crimes. Effective communication between jurisdictions enabled investigators to combine evidence from multiple locations into a single investigative framework. Advances in forensic genetics continue to influence cold case investigations today. New analytical methods are regularly evaluated by forensic laboratories, while investigators assess whether previously preserved evidence may benefit from improved testing procedures. The Cook Van Quillenborg investigation illustrates that scientific progress is cumulative. Each technological improvement builds upon earlier research rather than replacing established forensic principles. For historians of criminal investigation, the case marks an important period in the transition from traditional forensic methods to more advanced genetic analysis. It reflects broader developments that occurred throughout North America as laboratories expanded their capabilities and investigators incorporated new scientific tools into homicide investigations. Although each case presents unique circumstances, the underlying principles demonstrated by this investigation, careful evidence preservation, interagency cooperation, and adherence to legal standards remain widely applicable. Today, the investigation is remembered not only because it spanned more than 3 decades, but also because it illustrates how persistence and scientific advancement can intersect over time. The work performed by investigators in Washington and British Columbia during the original inquiry continued to provide value many years later, reinforcing the principle that every homicide investigation should be conducted with the expectation that future scientific developments may reveal information unavailable at the time the evidence is first collected. The investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg is frequently discussed within the broader context of cold case investigations because it illustrates how criminal investigations can evolve alongside scientific progress. The case demonstrates that evidence collected during an initial investigation may acquire new significance years or even decades later as forensic methods improve. Historically, many homicide investigations reached investigative dead ends, not because detectives failed to collect evidence, but because contemporary scientific techniques were unable to extract sufficient information from the material available. Biological evidence that could not be fully analyzed in the late 1980s became considerably more informative as DNA profiling advanced during the following decades. The Cook Van Quillenborg investigation reflects this broader transition in forensic science. Today, many law enforcement agencies maintain dedicated cold case units whose responsibilities differ from those of investigators responding to newly reported crimes. Rather than managing rapidly developing investigations, cold case detectives review historical files, identify evidence suitable for re-examination, and evaluate whether advances in laboratory science or investigative methodology justify reopening specific cases. The work often involves collaboration with forensic laboratories, prosecutors, and specialists in genealogy or other scientific disciplines. One of the central principles reinforced by the Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation is the importance of preserving all potentially relevant evidence, regardless of immediate analytical capability. Biological material, trace evidence, fingerprints, photographs, and written documentation may all become increasingly valuable as scientific techniques evolve. The investigation demonstrates that evidence preservation is not simply an administrative requirement, but a long-term investigative strategy. The case also illustrates the importance of maintaining comprehensive investigative records. Successive generations of detectives relied upon documentation created during the original investigation to understand witness interviews, crime scene observations, laboratory findings, and investigative decisions. Without accurate records, later investigators would have faced substantial obstacles in applying new scientific techniques to historical evidence. International cooperation remained another defining feature of the investigation. Because the victims originated in British Columbia and the crimes occurred in Washington state, agencies in Canada and the United States maintained communication throughout different phases of the investigation. Information sharing across jurisdictions allowed investigators to integrate evidence collected in different locations while respecting the legal requirements applicable within each country. In recent years, forensic genetic genealogy has become an increasingly discussed investigative tool. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation contributed to that discussion by demonstrating both the capabilities and the limitations of the technique. Genealogy generated investigative leads, but it did not replace conventional investigative methods. Detectives still relied upon direct forensic comparison, legal procedures, and corroborating evidence before criminal charges could be pursued. The investigation has also influenced professional education within forensic science and criminal investigation. Training courses frequently reference the case when discussing long-term evidence management, interagency coordination, and the relationship between emerging scientific methods and established legal procedures. It serves as an example of how technological innovation can complement traditional investigative practices without altering the fundamental requirements of criminal evidence. Beyond its technical significance, the investigation reminds law enforcement agencies that unresolved homicide cases continue to affect victims' families long after public attention has diminished. Maintaining communication with surviving relatives, preserving evidence responsibly, and periodically reassessing investigative opportunities remain important aspects of cold case management, regardless of how much time has passed since the original crime. The legacy of the Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation therefore extends beyond its legal outcome. It reflects the combined contributions of crime scene investigators, forensic scientists, detectives, prosecutors, laboratory personnel, and international partners who worked across several decades. Their efforts demonstrate that complex homicide investigations often require sustained institutional commitment as scientific knowledge and investigative methods continue to develop. Today, the case remains part of the historical record of forensic investigation in North America. It continues to inform discussions concerning evidence preservation, DNA analysis, cold case review procedures, and cross-border cooperation between Washington and British Columbia. As forensic science continues to evolve, the investigation stands as an example of how carefully preserved evidence and persistent investigative work can remain relevant long after a crime has occurred. More than 3 decades separated the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg from the major investigative breakthrough that ultimately changed the direction of the case. During those years, the investigation became an example of how homicide inquiries can remain active despite the passage of time, provided that evidence is preserved, investigative records are maintained, and agencies remain willing to revisit earlier conclusions as scientific methods develop. One of the enduring lessons from the investigation is that forensic science evolves continuously. Techniques considered state-of-the-art during one decade may later be replaced by more sensitive and informative methods. Consequently, the value of preserved evidence often increases over time. Biological material that could not be fully interpreted in 1987 became significantly more informative after advances in DNA profiling and, later, forensic genetic genealogy. This progression has influenced evidence retention policies in many jurisdictions. Law enforcement agencies increasingly recognize that biological evidence from serious violent crimes should be preserved whenever possible, even if immediate laboratory analysis cannot produce definitive results. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation illustrates why such policies remain important. Decisions made by investigators during the original inquiry directly affected the opportunities available to later generations of forensic scientists. The investigation also demonstrates the importance of comprehensive case documentation. Every interview, crime scene sketch, laboratory report, and evidence inventory created during the original investigation contributed to the historical record examined by subsequent investigators. Cold case detectives rely heavily on these records because they often inherit investigations many years after the original personnel have retired or transferred to other assignments. Another notable feature of the case was the cooperation between agencies operating in different legal systems. Canadian authorities assisted investigators by documenting the victims' backgrounds and reconstructing their activities before they entered the United States, while law enforcement agencies in Washington conducted the homicide investigation itself. This coordination reflects the broader reality that crimes involving international travel frequently require cooperation extending beyond local or regional jurisdictions. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation has also contributed to continuing discussions about the role of forensic genetic genealogy within criminal investigations. Since the technique became more widely known, agencies have developed policies governing its application, emphasizing that genealogy provides investigative leads rather than definitive proof. Traditional forensic comparison, lawful evidence collection, and judicial oversight remain essential components of any criminal investigation that incorporates genealogical analysis. Within forensic education, the investigation is regularly examined as part of broader discussions concerning cold case methodology. Students studying forensic biology, criminal investigation, and evidence management frequently encounter the case because it illustrates the interaction between scientific innovation and long-term investigative practice. The investigation demonstrates that successful outcomes often depend upon a combination of meticulous evidence preservation, careful documentation, scientific advancement, and sustained investigative effort. The broader historical importance of the case extends beyond forensic science. It also highlights the responsibilities carried by institutions investigating serious crimes over long periods. Maintaining evidence, preserving investigative knowledge, and supporting victims' families require organizational commitment that may continue for decades. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation reflects how such commitment can preserve investigative opportunities long after public attention has shifted elsewhere. Today, the investigation remains part of the history of criminal justice in both Washington State and British Columbia. It is frequently referenced in professional literature discussing DNA technology, evidence preservation, interagency cooperation, and the evolution of cold case investigations. Although every homicide investigation presents unique circumstances, many of the principles illustrated by this case careful documentation, scientific rigor, lawful investigative practice, and cross-border collaboration continue to guide investigators working on unresolved violent crimes. As forensic science continues to advance, the Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation serves as a reminder that unresolved cases should not be viewed as permanently unsolvable. Instead, they represent investigations whose future progress may depend upon scientific developments, careful evidence preservation, and the willingness of investigators to reassess historical evidence using methods unavailable to earlier generations. These lessons continue to influence homicide investigations throughout Washington, British Columbia, and the broader forensic community in North America. The investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg remains significant because it demonstrates how multiple elements of the criminal justice system can contribute to resolving a homicide investigation over an extended period. Rather than depending upon a single discovery or investigative method, the case developed through the cumulative effect of evidence preservation, scientific advancement, institutional continuity, and cooperation among agencies in both Canada and the United States. One of the defining characteristics of the investigation was the preservation of biological evidence collected in 1987. Crime scene personnel documented and stored evidence according to accepted forensic procedures, ensuring that later generations of investigators could re-examine the material using improved laboratory techniques. Although the scientific capabilities available during the original investigation were limited, preserving the evidence created opportunities that only became fully apparent decades later. The case also illustrates the importance of maintaining detailed investigative records. Cold case detectives inherited thousands of pages of reports, witness interviews, forensic analyses, photographs, and evidence inventories. These materials allowed investigators to understand not only what evidence had been collected, but also why particular investigative decisions had been made during the original inquiry. Such continuity is essential when investigations extend across many years and involve numerous personnel changes. Cooperation between Washington state investigators and Canadian authorities in British Columbia remained another essential component of the investigation. Because the victims began their journey in Canada before entering the United States, agencies in both countries contributed information necessary to reconstruct the timeline of events. Cross-border communication ensured that investigative findings, forensic results, and witness information could be evaluated within a broader factual context. The investigation further demonstrates how forensic science continues to evolve. Improvements in DNA analysis did not invalidate earlier investigative work. Instead, they expanded the value of evidence already collected. Each advancement built upon the foundation established by the original investigators. This relationship between careful evidence collection and later scientific innovation has become a central principle of modern cold case investigation. Another lesson concerns the role of multidisciplinary collaboration. Detectives, forensic scientists, crime scene specialists, genealogical researchers, laboratory analysts, prosecutors, and legal experts each contributed specialized knowledge during different phases of the investigation. No single discipline alone resolved the case. Rather, the investigation reflects how complex homicide inquiries often require coordinated expertise across multiple professional fields. The case has also informed professional discussions regarding the responsible use of forensic genetic genealogy. Since its application in several high-profile investigations, agencies have developed formal guidance addressing when genealogy should be considered, how investigative leads should be verified, and the importance of obtaining independent forensic confirmation before criminal proceedings are initiated. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation is frequently referenced in these discussions because it illustrates the distinction between generating investigative leads and establishing admissible evidence. Within forensic education, the investigation continues to serve as an example of long-term investigative management. Students and practitioners examine the case when studying evidence retention, documentation standards, laboratory development, and interagency coordination. The investigation demonstrates that effective homicide work often extends well beyond the initial response to a crime, requiring sustained institutional commitment over many years. The historical significance of the investigation therefore extends beyond its individual facts. It reflects broader developments in criminal investigation during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, including the growth of DNA technology, improvements in forensic laboratory practice, increased cooperation among jurisdictions, and the continuing reassessment of unresolved homicide investigations through new scientific methods. Today, the Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation remains an important reference within forensic science and law enforcement. For agencies in Washington and British Columbia, it illustrates how careful evidence preservation, comprehensive documentation, scientific progress, and international cooperation can collectively influence the outcome of a complex homicide investigation. These principles continue to guide investigators working on unresolved violent crimes and reinforce the importance of preserving every opportunity for future scientific examination, even when immediate answers are not yet available. The investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg occupies an important place in the history of forensic science and criminal investigation in North America. Although the crimes occurred in November 1987, the investigative work associated with the case continued for more than 3 decades, demonstrating how homicide investigations can evolve as scientific capabilities advance and institutional knowledge is preserved. At its core, the investigation illustrates the enduring value of careful evidence collection. Crime scene investigators working in 1987 documented the scenes, preserved biological evidence, maintained chain of custody records, and created comprehensive investigative files. Those actions were routine components of professional homicide investigation at the time, yet they ultimately allowed future generations of forensic scientists to apply techniques that did not exist when the crimes were committed. The case also demonstrates the importance of continuity within law enforcement. Numerous detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, laboratory analysts, and support personnel contributed to the investigation over several decades. Individual investigators retired or transferred, but the preservation of detailed case records enabled their successors to continue the investigation without losing the factual foundation established during the original inquiry. International cooperation remained another defining characteristic. Because Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were Canadian citizens traveling from British Columbia into Washington state, agencies on both sides of the border played important roles. Canadian investigators assisted in reconstructing the victims' backgrounds and travel plans, while American authorities conducted the homicide investigation and coordinated forensic examinations. The case is frequently referenced as an example of effective cross-border cooperation in a major criminal investigation. From a scientific perspective, the investigation reflects the broader evolution of forensic genetics. traditional DNA profiling, expanded laboratory capabilities, and later the development of forensic genetic genealogy each represented successive stages in the advancement of criminal investigation. Rather than replacing conventional detective work, these methods complemented established investigative procedures by generating new leads that required independent verification through lawful evidence collection and judicial review. The Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation has also influenced discussions regarding evidence retention policies. Many forensic agencies now emphasize the long-term preservation of biological evidence in serious violent crimes because future technological developments may significantly increase its evidentiary value. This principle extends beyond a single investigation and has informed broader approaches to cold case management throughout North America. Within professional education, the case continues to be examined by homicide investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and criminal justice students. Training programs frequently use the investigation to illustrate best practices in evidence preservation, interagency coordination, forensic documentation, and long-term case management. It demonstrates that successful investigations often depend upon cumulative efforts extending across many years rather than a single investigative breakthrough. The investigation further underscores the importance of balancing scientific innovation with established legal safeguards. Advances in DNA analysis and genealogy created new investigative opportunities, but every stage of the process remains subject to evidentiary standards, constitutional protections, judicial oversight, and the requirements of criminal procedure. The case, therefore, serves not only as a milestone in forensic science, but also as an example of how emerging investigative methods can be incorporated within existing legal frameworks. Today, the Cook-Van Cuylenborg investigation remains part of the historical development of modern homicide investigation. For agencies in Washington state and British Columbia, it illustrates the lasting value of meticulous crime scene work, comprehensive documentation, scientific research, and sustained cooperation across jurisdictions. The investigation continues to inform policy discussions, forensic training, and cold case methodology, reinforcing the principle that evidence carefully preserved today may become the foundation for future investigative progress. More broadly, the case reminds investigators that the passage of time does not necessarily diminish the possibility of new discoveries. As forensic science continues to evolve, previously collected evidence may reveal information that was inaccessible to earlier generations of investigators. For that reason, the investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg remains an enduring example of how persistence, scientific advancement, and professional collaboration can shape the history of criminal investigation, providing valuable lessons for future homicide inquiries in both Washington and British Columbia, and throughout the wider forensic community.